sorry. So we are recording the workshop today so that others can view the workshop after. We have all of our past workshop recordings on our YouTube page, so we encourage people to go and check it out there too. Today we have Ryan Sforza and Caelan Holcombe from Thriving Counseling, and we're super excited to have them here today. Today's workshop is on the intersection of IPV and the LGBTQ+ community. We felt like the right time was to do this workshop in June, since June is Pride, but we also know that IPV is an experience that is had by all and many, and sometimes marginalized groups experience it at higher rates. And it's also less talked about, or resources are not always as readily available. So at Resolve, part of our mission is to eradicate intimate partner violence. And so we feel like this is one of those ways, through community education for clients and for the community too. Quick housekeeping, the workshop will end today at 1 o'clock to be respectful and mindful of everyone's time. And that we will do a Q&A the last 15 to 10 minutes after. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat box or the Q&A box, and I will be there kind of fielding all those questions. If there's any housekeeping questions, I'll probably answer directly. Otherwise, we'll save it for the end. So I will turn it over to Ryan and Caelan. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Carly. All right.
Yeah, I am just gonna share my screen for the slides, so bear with me for a moment. To grant permission, apparently. Ryan, do you want to start for a second? Because I have to.
Sure. So today in the expansive community that we're represented, we're going to use some kind of encompassing language. So when we're referencing the LGBT and QIA and trans and gender nonconforming community, we're just going to use the community as a preface to kind of reference to that. If we're speaking specifically about like gender identity or gender expression identities, and then sexual orientation and romantic identities, we'll be a little bit more compartmentalized about what the language we're using, who we're directing to. But a little preface, Thriving Counseling Practice, we really focus on working with marginalized and minority communities. We serve 13 all the way up to, I think 93 is our eldest person right now. We are a team of clinicians, and we focus on working with the LGBTQ and trans community and other special actions. So a little bit about our practice and who we are, kind of went a little bit into that, but our practice goals are really trying to decrease inequitable accessibilities when it comes to mental health treatment. We also, as a profession, really try to take accountability and acknowledge that our profession specifically has had a long and arduous course of making a lot of barriers to care, especially for communities of color. And that all of my therapists, we use a sliding scale. We do participate in bartering services for any type of range of services we do. We offer gender affirming letters within 2 sections as well. So Caelan, you can go into your section first.
Awesome, thanks Ryan. Yeah, glad to be here today. And just a little bit about my background. So I've been an associate with Thriving Counseling since July of last year. Before that, I was working under Ryan's supervision as an intern, co-facilitating groups that we run in the community for trans and gender expansive folks. We also run an LGBTQ DBT group throughout the year. So that was a wonderful early experience for me in the profession. I also did an internship at Anthony Jordan Health Center, which was through an integrated care grant at St. John Fisher. And I graduated from Fisher last year in the midst of the pandemic, and jumped right into private practice working under Ryan. And I've really enjoyed getting to just start specializing in doing gender therapy and working with LGBTQ clients. Yeah, so I'll hand it over to Ryan.
So beyond my work with the practice, before I became a clinician, I have over a decade experience in working with LGBT community programming. So when I got my master's, I specifically got a master's in community mental health. And so a big part of my career has been creating community spaces for folks that generally don't have community spaces. So one big thing about the practice is that I'm known of serving the community where we have at least 2 to 3 psychotherapy groups that are devoted to minorities and communities of color all year round. So we currently have like 2 groups in session concurrently. So we're always trying to create community spaces that kind of really give the support that really is needed there. I also specializations, I'm a trauma therapist. I also have a chronic illness specialty. And then Caelan and I both do a lot of consulting work. A lot of this jargon that we're going to use, if some of the terminology is not that familiar for you, definitely reach out to us. We have a website, thrivingcounselingny.com. Caelan offers a training on something very basic and intermediately about like language and like identities and what does it all look like and how to be respectful. And then Caelan and I also do a little bit more advanced training for clinical staff. Specifically, I run an advanced training for how to assess gender dysphoria and how it could look, but we also have a lot of specific trainings that we could do. So if some of the stuff seems great and you would want to apply it to your own organization and application, contact us. We do that all the time. So let us know how we can serve you. Great. Go ahead, Caelan.
Right, great. So jumping right into the topic for today. We just kind of wanted to start by acknowledging, as Carly was saying, the scope of intimate partner violence in the community. As she was saying, it is much higher in marginalized communities, and that unfortunately is definitely the case with these populations. So more than 61% of LGBTQ survivors were turned away from a domestic violence shelter in 2012. That's when we have our statistics from, and then nearly a third were wrongfully arrested as the abusive partner. So in a situation where, the first responders, folks intervening, police, implicit bias influencing decisions on arrests and that not being accurate to the situation. And 14% of victims of intimate partner violence homicides were transgender women of color, while transgender individuals only account for 6.4% of the population. And these statistics we cite at the end of our presentation. They come from the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs. All right. So we wanted to start off by talking a little bit about, for providers, what are some things that we can be thinking about to create an affirming space, right? So thinking about our environments. And even for clients, these are the things that you might notice when you come into a new space, right? That we kind of use as safety cues, that if we notice certain things that maybe we'll feel more comfortable in disclosing. So in terms of physical space, what does the waiting area look like? Is it set up in a way that feels cozy, inviting? What does the website look like? Is it accessible? Is it straightforward? Is it transparent about what to expect when contacting for services? And in terms of providers, backgrounds and any training that they have in working with the community, specifically intake demographics. So forms are questions being asked about gender identity and sexual orientation, and in expansive ways, right? Where clients can name for themselves their own identity, and where non-binary isn't just the third gender box, right? Where we're thinking a little bit more beyond that. How are we finding providers? Are advertisements being used, or connections through other agencies, collaboration, that sort of thing? The language associated with the practice, and here, not just saying that we're affirming, but also being able to back that up with trainings that we've participated in, conferences that we're going to, a commitment to continuing education around that. Support groups, that are specific to the community, assumptions of the healthcare system, gendered expectations. So, wanting to see are those reinforced, or again, are folks, offering a more expansive view? Some things that people might look for are, pride flags or safe zone stickers, those sorts of things that indicate, that providers have gone through some level of training or have some awareness of the community. But again, just kind of signaling isn't enough, right? We need to be backing this up with action. And then intra-community relationships, having connections, collaboration with victim advocates and other providers in the area, organizations and service groups, LGBTQ liaison task force, professional associations, community endorsements, really becoming engaged and involved to become, part of, right? Not just on the sidelines. And to the end of community relationships, kind of looking at locally, our victim advocates and shelters having policies that exclude trans people. Often they do exclude trans women, right? Like a lot of shelters tend to be men's shelters or women and children shelters, and trans women might not be accepted in either. And if that is the case, where can we offer them safe housing? For non-binary folks, for people who are gender expansive, where are they supposed to go? And are they going to have to make a choice that undermines their gender identity? That can be really difficult for people to be dealing with that level of invalidation in such a vulnerable place in their lives. Does local law enforcement have an LGBTQ liaison working on community relations and training law enforcement on relevant information to provide more informed care? Are sexual assault nurses trained on LGBTQ current concerns and transgender, non-conforming, non-binary concerns? Are they thinking about using language to talk about people's body parts that is not going to be distressing for people, right? So kind of checking in about those sorts of things. I think Ryan's going to lead the next one.
So biggest thing about thinking about terms of safety is that my perception of safety is going to be certainly different from Caelan's and Carly's. So really kind of start thinking about, how do I frame safety and what is my purview and how is that going to influence the way I ask questions to people? Also for folks that find themselves as engaging in services, to actually really think about, like, what does safety look like for me? What does safety look like when I'm at home, when I'm driving, when I'm at work, when I'm maneuvering in the world, outer world, right? Maybe daytime, nighttime, what have you. The thing that comes into with the community spaces for folks is there's a level of layered identity ship. So when you're thinking about someone who's in a lot of compromising safety situations, they're thinking about themselves as a person, but also as a queer person, trans person, community of color person, right? So like there's a lot of different layers to safety, and to really think about what that means for people and how to really question it and think about it. So the biggest thing that what we try to do is an empowered level of giving to the person. So we really try to give power to the individual. Does my office feel safe to you? Are you in a safe space to have privileged talk? Are you in a safe place? For you, what is safety, right? What are the clues for you? Is it a feeling? Is it a sensation in your tummy, in your heart, in your, your tension in your neck region? And to ask permission, honestly, to really allow the patient to say no or not answer or respect it. Also, as a provider, to read those nonverbal cues of guardedness and resistance, to really hone into that there's a therapeutic alliance that's not fully developed, or you don't have that trust or that ability to have intimacy just yet, and to really heed to that. Also, the survivor and the thriver sets the pace, honestly. So if you're asking questions and they're getting a little bit more guarded, slow down, maybe retract, maybe kind of go down to a different tunnel that you can go into. Even ask, I want to know about that, but I'm sensing some guardedness. Let's kind of back up and kind of get back to like more like other questions that I can get to know you a little bit better. Always ask what their experience is. Caelan and I both know this. We work with a lot of people that have been victimized and have not had good situations with providers and with services that they're supposed to get good care with. So I'm always asking, What's been your experience with other providers? What's been your experience with other therapists? What's been your experience with your own PCP? Do you feel like you could share things with your PCP that you would share with your best friend? That's a huge question to ask, because healthcare is lifelong, right? And that should be a person that you can trust. And if you're going through something really terrible, hopefully you have the shared space to share that. Is documentation needed? We work with a lot of people that, whether or not they're actually getting services for trans care, we may or may not diagnose with gender dysphoria, because it can out them, especially for minors. So we're very mindful about what we're documenting in the clinical record, how we're diagnosing people. If there's ways that I can shield a person when I'm doing with a domestic violence case, the DSM does allow you to do V and Z codes, but often rarely I do not code those, but I will shield the patient as much as I can. Also, basic boundaries, right? So to really understand, what does a boundary look like? What does it feel like for a person? And how do they know when there might be a crossing going on, or a betrayal or a trespass? To really ask those questions. And the way that I identified is as a person, as their identity, as their relational identity, their ethnicity, so forth, right? So boundaries can be shifted and moved in different ways. Support pockets are huge. So I work with a lot of people that are super rural and really isolated, and they might have just one friend, and that might be online. Go them, honestly. Support pockets could be anywhere. Support pocket could also be animals or stuffed animals, right? So you can figure out support pockets that could be anywhere. Always a human-like support pocket is super helpful. I'm also trained in dream interpretation and reconstruction in a trauma-informed way. So for people that I work with that don't have a lot of community support, or the support they would get from the community is really hostile, just like in home, we create fantasy safe spaces. So it's in their mind that we create a safe space. There's going to be a moment where they can actually let their guard down and feel safe. And it's a place that they can go to. No one else can touch, right? So some really cool stuff that you can do for a person, but safety is huge.
Definitely. All right. We definitely wanted to also touch on psychological impact of minority stress and sexual violence. So what do we mean by minority stress? Well, the minority stress model is just a framework to better understand and acknowledge the impacts on marginalized people in terms of harassment, discrimination, stigma, socioeconomic impacts, interpersonal impacts. So chronic minority stress can lead to weakening of coping strategies. And we know that there's a correlation with that and poor health outcomes, shorter lifespan, a lot of consequences for folks. Yeah, so minority stress is multi-tiered and intersectional. You know, those identities intersecting can intensify distress. An example being, you know, a trans man who is African American and also, you know, identifies as queer. And then if you add on to that any type of physical disability or mental illness, you know, we're just kind of compounding the minority stress. So this is just, you know, an acknowledgement that people experience like multi-layered impacts, right? So you can be experiencing racism, transphobia, homophobia, all of these different things, and that they can occur both within a community and outside the community. So we know horizontal oppression can occur from within a community. For example, trans men in male queer spaces and gay men spaces may experience, you know, transphobia. So yeah, it's a complex issue. And sexual violence, you know, can contribute to PTSD, suicidal ideation, social anxiety, hypervigilance, and interpersonal issues. You know, the longstanding impacts of sexual violence and the way that an individual might be met when they share their experience with others can have a huge impact too. So as Ryan was speaking earlier, you know, is this individual in a hostile environment or an accepting and affirming environment? We know that there's such strong impacts from disclosures of sexual violence as well. It can really intensify experiences of shame internalized transphobia. And yeah, just, rape culture is so pervasive and unfortunately can be perpetuated in ideas and attitudes that even providers can embody at times. Violence justification, victim blaming can occur, especially as we're speaking about, these communities in particular. I think homophobia and transphobia often, are used as defenses, right? Like a lot of times when we hear about the death of trans women of color, being involved in sex work, being very vulnerable, and having a situation where they're murdered because someone felt, quote unquote, deceived or misled, right? And using that person's gender identity as the excuse for that violence. Felt stigma is also huge. For folks who might be new to the term, it's just a internalized stigma that an individual can experience even without having had themselves a negative experience with providers or healthcare setting, but just knowing of the fact that other people have experienced a level of discrimination or anti-serve practices in those settings could lead an individual to have felt stigma and to avoid engaging in healthcare systems out of fear that they would incur harassment, discrimination, or just lack of respect, right? Having to educate their provider on their identity or sexual orientation, and just the emotional labor that can really go into that. Especially as we speak about communities of color, because often for people of color, if they are, speaking up, advocating for themselves, can often be labeled as hostile by providers. So there's a lot of complexity around these issues, and weaponized stereotyping, we're going to get into more on this next slide.
Mm-hmm.
So we wanted to use an example to really bring to light what this can look like. So an example of weaponized stereotyping could occur in a situation of intimate partner violence where the thriver survivor is a trans man of color and their partner is cisgender and white. And that partner is the abuser in the situation. The abuser might weaponize stereotypes to use power and control in the relationship to prevent the thriver from coming forward and seeking help. So they might use the stereotype that a man is always the abuser in the relationship, that a woman, could never be perceived as the abuser. And, weaponizing implicit bias that Black men are in some way inherently violent, and using that and the very real threat of involving law enforcement as a way of controlling. So this is, an example, like fights get intense. My partner will threaten to call the cops and state I am the person who is threatening. She tells folks I get angry and she is worried about me. So really here we see someone controlling the narrative and using these stereotypes that we reviewed as a way of holding power in that situation. So as providers, what are the protective factors that we can cultivate in a situation like this? How do we use police in a safe way if that's necessary, especially if there's issues of active suicidal ideation, planning, means to carry out, if this is a situation where that's going on? How are we working with clients to prepare them for what to expect, but also to try to minimize harm in situations where we do need emergency workers involved? So in Rochester, we have the mobile crisis unit. They're not always able to respond immediately, so that's not always an option, but it's definitely an option to consider. And more recently, we have the person in crisis teams, which is led by social workers. Police are still involved in that situation, but the idea is that the social workers are there as well to try to mitigate harm and to really de-escalate situations, to be there as an advocate for an individual and to try to make any kind of intervention, just feel a little bit safer for community members. Other protective factors to cultivate: finding safer venues, creating multiple safety plans. So by that, we mean, taking into account someone's physical safety, but also their emotional, mental safety. We really need to be considering people holistically and what they need. And one safety plan might not cut it. Go plans. So working with clients on having a go bag packed, what's this going to look like? Do you have someone you can call who's supportive, safe, that you can crash on their couch or find, temporary housing with? Yeah, all of that. And
going more into minority stress and what it kind of looks like is that minority stress really comes from the historical practices that have been negative and historical instances where people have that built up stigma or felt stigma and also just stress, right? So commonly folks from the community do not view providers as trusting or safe. There's something that's called anti-surveying practices. It's specific when we're talking about gender and sexual minorities when they're engaging in healthcare services. So they've actually coined a term around this, and that's inclusive to communities of color as well. But what it is that we found that people, when they're engaging from the community into services and in community engagement, providers and institutions systematically say, we're not going to serve you. And this happens on the most basic scale of you are hurt, you need an ambulance ride, an ENT tech recognizes that you might be of the community or trans experience and says, I cannot serve you. It happens here in Monroe County. It happens in healthcare institutions in Monroe County, upstate New York, all of New York State, you name it, it happens. So it's really important to really ask a person's experience when they're engaging with people with a power differential and for care, and also what's been their experience when they're engaging with community services. Folks may conceal their medical information for protection, right? So to be very mindful of why someone's being guarded, right? Why someone's resisting maybe being impartial, maybe not sharing all the truths. It's really heeding to that therapeutic alliance that you get with that person or that trust with that person, right? Felt stigma is really real, prejudice and discrimination, asking people's experiences on that, right? Insightful interventions, and this is a very, very over quick view, very broad brush strokes. But do you feel safe here? How can I make you feel safer, more comforted? Discuss gatekeeping practices. If you do not know what that term is, definitely shoot us a question later on. We offer a training on that, but it's huge. There's a lot of practices that go on that maybe providers may not be aware of, and they instill and reinforce all the time. Acknowledge about previous clinical practices. If your institution that you work at hasn't been that great for minorities of color, haven't been that great for queer folks, for the community, for people that are disabled, X, Y, Z, to actually acknowledge that experience will actually hopefully harbor some type of accountability and service to the person that you're serving. Always ask about their experiences with healthcare providers and the folks with their lives, right? What is it like for you to talk to your partner about sensitive things? It will really clue you into about their dynamic, but also like how they convey that information to other people and how they might convey that information to you, right? A case study example I worked with, I received a client that already had a therapist, and the therapist reached out to me saying, you work with trans folk, I feel like you would be better suited. What I found out working with this person was that the person felt fine with the therapist on their trans identity, however, felt really undermined and underscored with what was going on with their relationship dynamic. And so what was going on, the original therapist really assumed a lot about DV context and assumed that my person that could not be aggressed on because they're gender fluid and like leaning demisexual, and their reciprocating partner was like a cis femme abuser. So the therapist assumed and even resisted that the female abuser could actually be abusive toward my patient, right? Basically on femininity and masculinity. A lot of times the therapist even downplayed and minimized what my person was trying to outline through individual email with the therapist or even in session. So it can look very differently across the lands.
Yeah, so, and here we wanted to acknowledge that sometimes fears can be co-opted by real problems. So Ryan was gonna start us off, and then I'll go into some of the protective factors that we would consider in these situations.
Yeah. So what we mean by this is what gets a little bit more difficult with communities of color and the community itself, is that the issues that exist currently when people are engaging with services and finding support and community are real problems. There's not enough programming. The fact that Out Alliance is gone and not a resource and doesn't look like it's going to revive anytime soon is a huge deficit in our community. So this is the issue when you're working with folks that come from the community when there's domestic violence and intimate partner violence, is that abusers use this information very really insightfully. They'll disclose intimate information, secrets, photos. I have a case where a person was married for 20 years, recently came out as transitioning. The ex-partner now, in terms of during the divorce, is posting old photos of their transition. My person's stealth at this point, so you would never know that or come from a trans experience. So these are the levels of trespasses and betrayals, using a partner's status as trans as a defense for not having custody, or turning the kids against the partner, using transphobia or homophobia or queerphobia, right? Unspoken threats, expressing if you express your gender, if you go to this point of your gender expression, I'm going to leave you, I'm going to take the kids, XYZ, or we're not going to have kids, or I'm thinking about leaving you. Also affirmation, we see this all the time, where people in the family, specifically the partner, will be like, fine, yeah, you could be that way, but I'm not going to do your pronouns. I'm not even going to refer you as a person. I'm going to tell my kids your information, that it's disgusting, that it's gross, that XYZ. I've also had people where they've said that the abuser partner has resisted telling the kids, and then really heavy-handed the gendered non-affirming narration with the kids, being like, oh, dad loves dad, and like really using kids as a way to control the narrative. Transphobia, ultimatum for young adults, with that family will rescind financial support if they pursue gender transition or to come out or to live the lifestyle that they're wanting to. Medical access restriction is a huge problem. So whether it's insurance, visits, hiding, or actually taking away their hormones or other medications, holding them hostage with that type of care as well. We see that all the time. Caelan's going to go into a little bit the traditional protective factors.
Yeah, so as Ryan was saying, with not having the Out Alliance around, there's definitely a deficit right now in this area. And, traditionally when we're working with clients who are survivors of intimate partner violence, we want to be looking at relationship and community factors. And unfortunately for trans community, for trans people of color and people of color in the LGBTQ community, there are deficits in terms of what we would consider social capital, right? So those relationships where we can expect tangible support from people, having people in your life who have the ability to let you stay with them for a while or to offer financial support, friendships that are enduring and strong, where you've known someone a long time. you know, unfortunately for a lot of trans people, they can lose a lot of community when coming out. So that's not always something that we can expect. Community factors, you know, does this client feel safe in their community? Not only safe, but do they feel connected to people? Do they feel that there's, you know, mutual trust, mutual aid, that folks are, you know, interested in their well-being and kind of reaching out to make sure that they're doing okay? Just knowing that a lot of people feel that they're burdening others when they reach out for support. So we really want to be looking at, are there people looking out for you so that, you know, we can lessen some of the burden on you to reach out for support? What is that looking like? And, you know, trying to work with clients to coordinate, you know, them receiving services and support from community agencies. You know, it can mean so much to be involved in that kind of warm handoff, especially for providers to reinforce a client's name and pronouns, especially if they haven't been able to legally change their name. That can go a long way in terms of mitigating the potential for microaggressions.
So what it looks like specifically, we're going to break this down. So instead of just doing the whole community, which is very expansive and changing, I'm constantly learning, especially with my littles. They say a new identity name and I got to go and research and ask them what that means for them. So you're always learning, if anything. So power control specifically when you're in the sexual and relational identity ship status. So we broke it down into like what it could look like as a survivor or thriver, and what it could look like when the sexual and relational community member is the aggressor. For the survivor, what it might look like is that there's a resistance to engage in community activities, right? So when you're asking like, what do you do in your spare time and what do you do, right? And you're like, oh, I just stay home, I do nothing, right? You want to really assess like what's going on there. If any point they're going strong about pursuing their identity and feeling confident, and all of a sudden they're reverting and going back, you want to really ask about what's going on there. What is pausing on their journey for self-identity ship, right? If there's a question about one's identity, really going into, is that internal questioning or is there outside questioning coming in and they're feeling a certain type of way or not feeling confident that they can be that identity? Worried about photos or places or being seen, how they're being perceived, right? That level of hypervigilance coming out when they're outside in the outer world. Limited ability to voice their feelings, emotions, and guardedness. That is a big one that I would recommend for folks to be clued into, especially of how they're talking about their feelings and emotions and feeling like they have a brave space to talk about that. Also with the aggressor, what it could look like is just like how we've been going into these days is the aggressor of the community with sexual and relational minorities is that they may convince the partner to not reach out, invoking fear, a homophobic response, right? You're gonna maybe get, if you go to that bar, it might not be really great. Like people are gonna be nasty to you, or like people are not gonna wanna talk to you, right? Aspects of the identity and expression, controlling that, right? You could have a pride flag, but you can't have it anywhere outside of the bathroom, right? You can't wear those clothes. You can't wear pins. You can't do X, Y, Z. Using outing as a form of threat as well. That's what it could look like as well as power control, and outing on so many different levels, like names and pronouns, their identity, their perceived identity, maybe their old identity, right? So using that information purposefully, limiting community connections, not using or heeding to safe sex practices, and to belief, maybe just disbelief. You're not trans, you're not asexual, you're not bisexual, or if you're bisexual, you're gonna be cheating on me, right?
Yeah, and just really briefly, this was a case study we wanted to go into to just kind of explore a little bit more in depth what it can look like. Kind of unusual situation that we might not think of as intimate partner violence, but definitely a situation where a family is being abusive and controlling toward a young adult. So this is a client that I've been working with for a year now, pansexual trans man. who is a survivor both of religious abuse and emotional and financial abuse in his family of origin. So parents use the threat of revoking financial support for college as a means to control this individual from pursuing gender transition. So he has been told he can't start hormones or, have access to gender affirming surgery. That if he does and they find out, they're gonna stop helping him pay for school and he would be disowned and on his own have to figure out what to do. Family using, conservative religious values to justify homophobic and transphobic beliefs. Historically, having sent this young person to Christian therapists who engaged in unethical counseling around, their gender identity and sexual orientation. Dismissing the child's gender identity as a phase. It's been over a decade now. So we joke about that sometimes about like, if this is a phase, it's been a very long standing phase, longer than the period of their life where they were not out. Parents refusing to acknowledge or use the child's pronouns or name, despite this young person having been very independent and legally changed their name 3 years ago as soon as they were able to. So protective factors that we worked on cultivating together. This young person had a history of suicide attempts and has really been motivated to live now out of spite. So we've said, all right, let's use that anger. It might not, hold for a lifetime, but it'll get us through for now. And this individual has also started the process of really differentiating from their family and religion of origin, coming to terms with being an atheist in addition to, not living up to in quotes, what his parents' expectations were for him. Empowerment around boundary setting and protecting his health records and his academic records. So really letting him know what his rights are and what can we do to keep him safe. So making sure that mail for medical appointments is not coming home, making sure that the address is going to friends, having a lockbox at home so that he can have all of his legal documents in a safe that's locked. So it's not kept with parent stuff so that if he has to get out, he can grab that stuff and go. Yeah, I'm not going to go into all of this because we're trying to zip through, but we will share the slides so folks can peruse later. So power and control now we kind of broke this down to transgender, non-conforming, non-binary relationships. So when the community member is the survivor, they might experience being intentionally misgendered, belittled, disregarded in use of language, fear to discuss their identity. So that's kind of some of the felt stigma we were talking about earlier. Fear to explore their identity, fears to engage in services, being threatened to be outed to their workplace, to their friends, to their family before they're ready, right? Having that control, that choice taken away from them. Denied access to affirming gender attire or medical care by a partner. Being told that they're not deserving of better, that they won't find love, right? And this is huge because this is a huge fear that a lot of trans folks have. And so when a partner uses this, unfortunately, it's so impactful and effective because it's such a deep-seated fear that a lot of folks have around coming out and coming into their own. Having limited or no sexual empowerment, freedom, or safety. And then sexual activity stereotyping. So this could be a partner forcing them into being in a specific role sexually that they're not comfortable with, or touching genitals that they don't want touched in a certain way, right? Or just refusing to respect their boundaries and what is okay in a sexual relationship.
What it looks like when the person is the aggressor for trans and gender conforming and non-binary is a lot of those minority stress and internalized transphobia and phobia is really compacted. So control aspects of identity and expression, right? if a person is a trans woman and who's an aggressor and their reciprocating partner's male, to really kind of reinforce that notion that they're heterosexual and roles that their male partner need to do or should do, and like how they should be treated and X, Y, Z. Using outing as a form of threat as well. That's what we can see as an aggressor. Sometimes people may not want to be seen as a queer couple, right? And that could be specific to themselves, but using that as I can go on social media and say that we are a queer couple, and that I had a case where the person was the aggressor of the community, and they purposely want to paint their partner as very conservative politically and how they believed in a lot of things, and to kind of get that social media reaction. Twisting who's the aggressor, that is very common. Limiting connections to the community due to not being trans affirming. We can't go to that experience because I know for sure they're not going to be trans affirming, and I don't want to go there and have bad treatment. The use of HRT means of a sexual right to engage in sexual practices. I hear this all the time for my trans men and trans masc folks, is that once they're on testosterone, they have the fear of being aggressive, or I've heard other people use in a sense of a means of defense and justification. Oh, it's my testosterone dose that's making me hit you. It's my testosterone dose that's making me angry and yell all the time, right? It's false. Accusing the partner of not being supportive when including the transition decisions. So another case study is that the cisgender partner is the survivor, and the trans partner, who's a trans woman spoonie, is the abuser. So this is what it looks like when the tables are a little bit flipped. So the abuser is using her identity as means of control and restrict community engagement with the survivor, right? Uses guilt or perceived sense of stigma to keep them isolated, right? There's nowhere we can go because then people are going to mistreat me as trans. They're going to know I'm trans, right? Using estrogen as an excuse for quick mood reactions, right? It's my estradiol that's making me have these quick mood reactions, and yelling and controlling and crying spells and heating you that you need to stay home with me. In the moment for this case, what happened was that the level of boundary crossing really went to a level of intimacy and betrayal, where the abuser really pushed their safe sex practices and continually crossed the partner's boundaries and had a limited ability to assert no and feel safe doing so. And then went on further that the abuser would disclose to friends about the sexual activity. So that level of power and control and leverage of controlling the person. Protective factors to cultivate in session with the survivor. I kind of noticed the resistance talking about her feelings, and often talked about her partner's feelings and emotions, and defended the actions of the partner. So really clue into the dynamic, really trying to work on, is there ways that she could engage on the community that is shielded from her partner, and do ways that she can tap into support that her partner's not aware of. Boundary work was really big, creation of emotional vulnerability in a space and session, enhancing her voice and sense of self. Also just psychoeducation about boundary setting and LGBT healthy relationships was huge. The other thing I want to add is the base mark is to find what safety means for a person, but also when they feel brave. So like safety is like just the baseline of feeling okay in oneself and occupying other spaces, but actually participating and doing and engaging is being brave. So really trying to figure out those two different.
All right, so included the new intersex inclusive pride progress flag and then our references, and I will end sharing screen so we can go to our Q&A.
Well, thank you both so much. It was so informative. It was really useful. I was jotting down lots of notes. I liked a lot of, for me, I'll just say what I found so useful was there was a lot of language that you all intentionally used that I think could really help elevate the work that we are doing at Resolve to be even more inclusive, or to be inclusive. I also really love we talk about like what is safe, and what we know for trauma survivors is often there's not a strong sense of internal or external safety. But I also love the idea of like what is brave, because I think that gives people a stronger sense of where are they at, how are they healing, what progress are they making. So we do have a question. We have a couple questions, and I encourage people just keep your questions coming in as you go. So we have a question. How have you seen survivors retain their connection to the LGBTQ plus community after an abusive relationship? Do you have any advice for survivors who are trying to navigate LGBTQ plus spaces where their abuser might be at? Which is an excellent question.
Very good question. In the time that we find ourselves now, there's a lot of tele and remote services that are available to folks. So I know plenty of people that are locally in New York State, but attending an Al-Anon meeting in Tennessee or Kentucky and getting support services. So that's one thing that I would recommend for folks to look out for. There's also things that you could do where you could attend still meetings that maybe your ex-partner does not attend. And you could also work in ways to ask the facilitator if that's doable. Most groups in the community are aware of how to protect folks that there might be safety concerns, and there's group rules as well that exist. The biggest issue is that when you're a thriver, you have to kind of let them know what's going on to see what is the boundaries and what could be adhered to. Trying to think of other, Caelan, you got anything on that question?
Yeah, I think, speaking to what you were saying, like in terms of support spaces, like there are a lot of LGBTQ specific support spaces online right now. Not just around Al-Anon, but also for various mental health struggles. But certainly, I think as well, kind of, if you've got a support network, a social network, to kind of enlist the help of those people as well, if going out, kind of safety in numbers. So if you're going to a space, or you want to be going into a space, but you think your ex-partner might be there, of maybe having a plan of like, okay, I'm going to go with other people who I know are not going to escalate the situation, but be able to help me maneuver that space in a way that feels safer, although it might not feel, the safest, just because recognizing running into someone, could be very triggering for sure. So it's not an easy situation to navigate.
Community stuff too, like Instagram, Tumblr, Reddit, like Twitch, Stream, like there's so many other places that you can find community that's super inclusive. So good question.
Yeah. Another question: when survivors of the community have to engage with systems where they know there may be a history of bias, phobia, oppression, what can individuals do or say to help advocate for themselves to get the support that they need?
Good question. So what we know for the community is that they will just tolerate the experience. I've worked with plenty of people that know where they have to engage for the care, and they know what they're going to endure, and they just tolerate it. So to really prime your patient of checking in how they're doing, how they feel about this. If you know for sure, like I have to refer you to the service and I know for sure their experience has not been great for trans women, to prime your patient. So say, this sucks, we could talk about it, we could be angry about it and sad, and there's ways that I can advocate for you, right? But also just really preparing that mentally that this is not going to feel good on their identity, but this is like, we need to do this care and the service. So really working with the patient about how they're feeling about it, and to welcome anger, and to really figure out how you address anger on your level as a provider, because you have a lot of power and privilege.
There's another question that kind of piggybacks off that one. But with the time we have, maybe it's almost like a seminar, this question, but the person is curious to learn a little bit more about gatekeeping in health systems. And I'll also just say there's another question about orders of protection, just in case you want to, yeah.
I can speak a little bit to gatekeeping. So yeah, I do think this is a really complex issue, and it's something that Ryan has a lot of familiarity with. So it definitely could be its own 1-hour presentation. I'll just say specifically for trans folks, this can manifest in ways of requiring a diagnosis of gender dysphoria in order to access gender affirming care. And so a gatekeeping practice can look like a clinician, a therapist, not being transparent about what their process is with a client and kind of leading them along and saying like, yeah, I've worked with trans people before. I could take you, I can work with you, but not having any experience in writing a letter to support them in getting access to hormones or whatever they're seeking, and not really having any intention of offering that to them. Unfortunately, this is very, very common. And so that's what we mean by gatekeeping. It's situations where medical providers are able to determine who has access and who doesn't. So it can also look like having very normative ideas around what someone needs to look like or be like to be trans, and saying, well, if you're non-binary, then, I don't want to, I don't think you're deserving of hormones or whatever the case might be. So it can be pretty complex.
Yeah, I think you all spoke to it really well too when you were talking about when we think about DV or IPV emergency or crisis services, and we think more specifically about shelter and how our shelters are set up. And that's, I think, also a great example of gatekeeping.
Sure.
We have a question. If someone from the community needs to pursue an order of protection, are there certain community specifics that they should advocate to include?
Definitely if they're involved with the community, if they work in different places, if they're involved like in the institutions that they work with, additional to organizations or associations or any physical safety spaces, I would advocate of like really identifying like movability and like logistically how someone like goes to and from and possible interaction on that. I work with a person where for the order of protection, we looped into RTS. So there was a huge concern that their ex was gonna purposely like find out the bus route that they'd be on and like get on and do like the long bus route. And so with the order of protection, we looped into that service that the abuser could not actually use RTS. So to even think about like how we maneuver in society and like what is the means of that and how can we set up boundaries? It's a really good question.
That was great. I want to offer to the group, the workshop, do you all have any other questions? Any questions that are coming up for folks? I will also offer, I think I really liked the case examples that you offered. I think oftentimes we see when we're working with survivors, we see about tactics of gaslighting and isolation, denying or minimizing a person's experience, even denying that their reality exists as they're experiencing it. And I think that it seems the not using pronouns as a tactic is really just one, I think, for people in the community or clients, allies, providers to really be in tune with. And then kind of this idea of like assessing for IPV with the folks that you're working with. If you're working with somebody who identifies in the community but is not expressing themselves that way internally or externally, that might be a warning sign that there might be abuse present in their relationship. And it's, yeah, just really useful tips. And I think what's always useful about this when we talk with survivors and we talk about tactics or experiences of survivors, sometimes it really helps shine a light of something they may be experiencing but are not yet identifying that way. And that's always such a way to open a door for support and services. So we really thank you.
Yeah, great. We offer training all the time. This is so broad strokes. If there's anything that people want to talk about, or Caelan and I are always available to talk with folks. So yeah, appreciate the opportunity.
Well, thank you all so much for presenting today. Thank you everybody for coming and joining. We recorded our workshop today, so it will be on the Resolve YouTube page so folks can access at a later date if you want to watch again, or if you know of people who weren't able to attend, please share with your community. And as always, Resolve will be hosting our virtual workshop on the third Monday of every month. So the next one will be July, oh no, I don't have my calendar open to know offhand, July 19th. And the topic is to be determined, so stay tuned. And also let us know if you have something that you really are itching to learn more about. We are so open to suggestions. So thank you, everybody.